Now, many people do not realize that our founding fathers established America primarily as a republic and not as a democracy. When we say the pledge to the flag, we say, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands." We don't pledge allegiance to a democracy. Well, what's the difference? And why was this point so important to our founding fathers? David Barton explains.
Why was there such a big emphasis on keeping godly people in office? It dealt with the fact that we were a republic and not a democracy, and there is a vast difference between the two. You find that the founding fathers absolutely abhorred democracies, and yet today we hear ourselves called a democracy. But if you think, the Pledge of Allegiance, we pledge allegiance to a republic, not a democracy. Prominent founding fathers explained why. You see, for example, Fisher Ames. This is the author of the First Amendment. September the 20th, 1789, he gave us the First Amendment, but he said very simply that a simple democracy has been very aptly compared to a volcano that contained within its own bowels the fiery materials of its own destruction. He said a democracy is a bomb waiting to go off. It's a volcano waiting to explode. Well, similarly, Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration from Pennsylvania, said it this way, and Benjamin Rush was never one to mince words. He said very simply, a democracy is the devil's own government. Or if you move to John Marshall, one of the major top Chief Justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, his is the face and stone there at the apex of the Supreme Court today. John Marshall very clearly said, between a republic and a democracy, the difference is like that between order and chaos. You see, the Founding Fathers so much hated democracy, and there were many democracies of their day. Russia had a democracy, France had a democracy, Italy had a democracy. They saw democratic governments, they despised them. So to make sure that we never became a democratic government, they very simply, at the Constitutional Convention, put in a clause to ensure that we would be a republic, not a democracy. Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution very simply says that each state shall maintain a republican form of government. Now today we've lost the definition between the two, but allow Noah Webster to define it, because he did define it for the students, and he told them why it was important to elect godly people to preserve our republican government. He said, the brief exposition of the Constitution of the United States will unfold to young persons the principles of republican government. He said, it is the sincere desire of the writer that our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. You see, the Founding Fathers very clearly explained that what they had built was on biblical principles. The only way to preserve the government they had given us was to elect people who respected those principles and to place them in office. And this is why the Founding Fathers put an emphasis on godly people in office, because we were a republic and not a democracy.
Now, since this is such an important point, I asked David Barton to explain further the differences between a republic and a democracy. Listen.
So what is the difference between a republic and a democracy? Well, very simply, a democracy is simple majority rule. Whatever 51% of the nation wants, that's what it gets. Now, a republic is quite different. A republic is defined as the rule of a nation on the basis of unchanging law. That was given by John Locke. It was also given in Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law, which this was the legal textbook that we used in America for 160 years. From 1766 till 1920, this provided the basis of republic. This was our definition. And it pointed out that in a republican form of government, those things on which God had already legislated, man was not free to legislate. It said, for example, in the specific case of murder, man can pass no law on murder other than that which God has passed. God has said everything that needs to be said about murder. Therefore, in a republic, it didn't matter if 75% or 89% of the people wanted to abolish murder. In a republic, it would always be murder, because in the Scriptures, it's always murder. You see, the legal textbooks pointed out the basis of republic was the unchanging law of the Bible. Now, they also pointed out that in our form of government, we had many things that our legislature was free to act on. Again, the law book said specifically, it said, in the instance of importing and exporting wool. The Bible says nothing about how to import and export wool. Our legislature can do what it wishes with importing and exporting wool. You see, it was very simple. We are basically a democratic republic. We can decide what we want in certain areas, but with the view of the Founding Fathers, as a republic, a Bible-based republic, there were certain rights and wrongs that would always stand. Murder, rape, all these things that are listed in the Ten Commandments and in so many Old Testament laws would always be wrong. And that's why we were a republic and not a democracy. It was not up to the whim of the people. You see, Benjamin Rush called a democracy a mobocracy. He said they can get on whims, they can go off on a tangent, and in one vote they can abolish everything that we've done. He said we are not that type of government. and that's why they gave us a republic and not a democracy.
Now, in any election, even the ones we have today, the question comes up, should we emphasize looking at the private life of an individual, or forget that completely and only examine his public life? Well, what did our Founding Fathers think? Listen.
So what type of requirements did the Founding Fathers put out to recognize good candidates for office? Well, there was much written about it. Many of the Founding Fathers wrote textbooks, and they put down in those textbooks the requirements for public office. One of the things that you'll find they always emphasized was looking at the private life of an individual. They said private life is always real life. That's where you can always see what a person's really like. And they gave examples, for example, of Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold had a great public life, but his private life was corrupt. He was a traitor in private. You couldn't see that in public. They said that's why you don't look at the public, you look at the private. So they encouraged the investigation of private life. Now, when the Founding Fathers taught others about these principles, they took great care to emphasize, again, the private life. Now, John Witherspoon is a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he taught many of the Founding Fathers. And so he is a good one to look to on what are the requirements for political office, because he really can be called the father of the Founding Fathers. He produced nearly 1/3 of the Founding Fathers that we have, and he himself was a Founding Father. Now, he wrote about how to identify a true American patriot in his writings at Princeton. He was the president of Princeton University, and these are his writings from 1803. And this is what he taught in school. And he gave the students 3 ways to identify an American patriot. These are his words. He says, what follows from this? That he is the best friend to American liberty, who, number 1, who is most active and sincere in promoting true and undefiled religion. He says, number 2, whoever sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down on profanity and immorality of every kind. And he says, number 3, whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I don't hesitate to call him an enemy to his country. Now here's the father of the Founding Fathers giving 3 requirements for office. He said, number 1, a true patriot is the one who is the most active and most sincere in promoting true and undefiled religion. He said, number 2, a true patriot is the one who sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down on profanity and immorality of every kind. And why is that a sign of patriotism? Because the Founding Fathers knew that if you had a profane and immoral people, you would have a profane and immoral government. And a profane and immoral government, history shows, does not last. So if you love your government, if you want a good government, you work on bearing down on profanity and immorality. And then he said, thirdly, he said, whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I don't hesitate to call him an enemy to his country. He said, everything we founded this on, all that we fought for have been godly principles. Whoever opposes God, therefore, opposes the very basis of America. Now, so strong were they about looking at the private characteristics, at the moral qualifications, at the religious qualifications, that Noah Webster may have perhaps said it better than any other. Noah Webster had a textbook that he wrote for students, and this textbook, written in 1823 by the Founding Father Noah Webster, told them about voting. And it said very clearly, he said, it is alleged by men of loose principles and defective views of the subject that religion and morality are not necessary or important qualifications for political stations. And hear that. And that's what we hear all the time today. But Noah Webster said it's only by people with loose views or poor views of the subject that say we shouldn't look at moral or religious qualifications. He goes on and he says this. He says, but the Scriptures teach a different doctrine. The Scriptures direct that rulers should be men who rule in the fear of God, able men such as fear God, men of truth who hate covetousness. And then look at this. He says, when a citizen gives his vote to a man of known immorality, he abuses his civic responsibility. He sacrifices not only his own interest, but he betrays the interest of his neighbor, and he betrays the interest of his country. Noah Webster said, if you vote for a person who is known to be immoral, he said, you're a traitor to your country, because what you're putting in office is the very thing that will destroy the country. You see, it takes moral qualifications, religious beliefs, in the eyes of the Founding Fathers to be qualified for office.
Now, why is it important to examine what our Founding Fathers said and put into the historic documents of our country? Well, it's important because they established the direction that America would go. They listed the qualifications they expected we would have for leadership in the future. They set the standards for education so that the next generation would maintain good government. In all 3 areas, they solidly established our country on Christian principles. When one reads what the Founding Fathers said and what they did, it's sad to think how far we have wandered from our heritage. Now, next week, we're going to examine the writings of Christopher Columbus, as well as the Mayflower Compact that the Pilgrims wrote, and I hope that you'll join me to hear some surprising information that is a part of our American history. Goodbye, God bless you. We'll see you next week.